Thank you for being here today. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you. I'm excited to present a topic that I've been thinking a long time about. The question of the death of Josiah, its meaning, its significance, and more importantly, its reception across the history of the Bible. I think that his death was of absolutely critical significance. I think it underlies much of what we read in some prophetic texts in Zechariah chapter 12. I think it has major implications for our understanding of Revelation 16:16 and the location of Armageddon. In today's paper, though, I want to lay the foundation for some of that discussion by looking at the two earliest references to the death of Josiah, the one found in 2 Kings and the other found in 2 Chronicles. We're going to compare and contrast the way Kings and Chronicles handle Josiah's death. And in the end, hopefully we'll have some time to discuss some of the historical sources, or I should say some of the Jewish reception sources from the 5th century on down through the New Testament era that deal with his death, although we'll do that very briefly at the end. So without further ado, the name of our title today is The Great Tragedy, Josiah's Death at Megiddo. King Josiah of Judah died fighting Pharaoh Neco at Megiddo in 609 BC. Josiah's death was the most devastating tragedy in the history of the Davidic kings of Judah. The impact of his death can be broken down into several phases of reception. First, the end of the kingdom of Judah, which is about 609 to 562 BC. That's the death of Josiah to the writing of the book of Kings, when we have Jehoiachin elevated from his captivity in Babylon. Second is the exilic explanation. I'd put this after the destruction of Jerusalem, all the way up into the time period after the writing of Zechariah, dealing with what Josiah's death might have meant. And then third, from about 520 onward, and there's some overlap here, thinking about the eschatological expectation of what Josiah's death might mean. For this paper, I will focus primarily on the first of these categories, with some discussion about the evolving perspectives related to the meaning of the death of Josiah for the kingdom of Judah, exiled Judeans, and finally Jews, as well as believing Gentiles who lived under empire. The purpose of this study is to understand the textual and historical foundations of Judah's greatest royal tragedy. These underlie the legendary reception of Josiah's death across Jewish and Christian tradition. Death details. Death details are one of the main features of the Deuteronomistic characterization of both Judah and Israel's kings. There is a clear formula for ending a given king's characterization by describing their cause of death, the location of their death, and their type of burial. The chronicler largely reproduces these details from Kings, but he mostly excludes Israelite elements and sometimes has additional details or variant traditions about the death and burial of Judahite kings. In the case of Josiah, the difference between Chronicles and Kings is especially important for understanding the significance of Josiah's death. 21 Judahite kings reigned for 4 centuries in Jerusalem. This is the house of David, from David all the way to the last king, Zedekiah. When we look at these kings, they all died. 13 died of natural causes, 4 died by assassination, 3 died in exile, all of which happened after Josiah, and 1 died in battle. That, of course, is Josiah. In terms of location, 15 died in Jerusalem, 1 died at Lachish, which is a bit of an outlier, 2 died at Megiddo. This is going to be Josiah and Ahaziah, and 3 died in exile. For location, 18 were buried in the city of David, 3 were presumably buried in exile. If we turn our attention to the houses of Israel, this would be the house of Jeroboam, Baasha, Omri, Jehu, and Menachem. About the same number of kings, 20 kings ruled over this kingdom, but for about half the amount of time, for about 200 years. They also reigned in 3 different capitals, Shechem and Tirzah, Jeroboam, and then 5 reigning from Tirzah, and then the majority, 14, reigning from Samaria. The causes of death is very different than we have for the southern kingdom. 8 died of natural causes. 9 died by assassination from a rival, a very distinctive characteristic of the northern kingdom. 1 died from sickness. 1 died in exile, and 1 died in battle. One who died in battle, also very important for the characterization of the death of Josiah. The location of death varies. We have 10 in Samaria, the majority, 4 in Tirzah, 1 at Gibbeton, 1 at remote Gilead, 1 at Naboth's vineyard, 1 at Ibleam, and 1 in exile. The location of Israelite burial is different than the southern kingdom as well. 9 are not given a burial notice at all. 8 were buried in Samaria, 2 were buried in Tirzah, and 1 was buried at Naboth's vineyard. According to Kings, most of the Davidic rulers before Josiah died either by natural causes or assassination in Jerusalem. Amaziah, Ahaziah, and Josiah were the only 3 Judahite kings who died away from Jerusalem. Josiah was the only Judahite king who died while fighting a foreign king in battle. Before Josiah, all the kings of Judah were buried in the city of David or nearby, although there's a trend of burying outside of the ancestral tombs with his father and grandfather, Ammon and Manasseh. But after Josiah, 3 of the last 4 kings died in exile, buried in foreign lands, which means Josiah's tragic death stands out as a major turning point for the house of David, the capital city of Jerusalem, and of course, the kingdom of Judah overall. The one outlier is Amaziah. He was assassinated at Lachish, probably around 796 BC. However, the geographical circumstance of his assassination relates to the king's release from a 15-year-long captivity in Samaria, as well as the prominence of Lachish during this period, since it was the second most important city in Judah. In other words, there does not seem to be a special literary or intertextual connection between the death of Amaziah as there is between the deaths of Ahaziah and Josiah. These 2 deaths, despite being over 200 years apart, have very interesting parallels in the book of Kings. You can see these here, Ahaziah and Josiah. On the Israelite side, if we look at the death of Ahab, despite the fact that 20 kings died, many of them in pretty gruesome ways, there's only 1 king who died in a foreign battle against a foreign king, and that, of course, would be Ahab. My students know that I love obscure biblical trivia, especially of the intertextual geographical variety. My favorite trivia question is, which 2 kings of Judah died at Megiddo? Of course, by now you already know the answer, Ahaziah and Josiah. But consider the implications of such an answer. Why would a Judahite king ever die at Megiddo? Megiddo had been a Canaanite major city. Later, it was turned into a northern Israelite stronghold. And by the time of Josiah, and maybe even a little bit before that time, it was an Assyrian provincial capital from about 732 BC onward. Judahite kings, as we've seen, died in Jerusalem, not in the plain of Megiddo. With that in mind, let's examine the setting of Ahaziah's death through the lens of this tragic king's family history. King Ahaziah of Judah was the doomed offspring of the unfortunate union of King Jehoram of Judah and Queen Athaliah. This union was the result of an ill-fated alliance between King Jehoshaphat of Judah and King Ahab of Israel. This, in effect, was built on the disastrous political marriage of Ahab to Jezebel, the Sidonian princess and priestess. While we do not have the ages of the Israelite kings like we do for most of the Judahite monarchs, only Asa is not included, maybe also Jehoram, we can conclude that King Omri arranged the marriage of Ahab to Jezebel, which is stated in the text, but he perhaps also arranged the marriage of Athaliah, his granddaughter, to Jehoram, prince of Judah. This is the parents of Ahaziah. Unfortunately, we do not know the age of Asa, and kings, but Jehoshaphat, his son, would have been between the ages of 22 to 33 during the reign of Omri, and Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, would have reached the age of 11 or 12 before Omri died. So it's interesting that we can kind of reconstruct some of these background details. Ahaziah's family was, in a word, problematic, especially on his mother's side. Let's start with his grandparents. The Judahite prince was born around 862 BC. By this point, Ahaziah's grandparents, Ahab and Jezebel, had already placed Yahweh with Baal as the head of the Israelite pantheon by killing off the prophets of Yahweh and even building a house of Baal in Samaria. In response, Yahweh reigned over Baal on Mount Carmel, pun intended. And Elijah the prophet executed Jezebel's prophets of Baal at the river Kishon, which is, of course, near Megiddo. This did not stop Ahaziah's grandma and grandpa from murdering Naboth, stealing his land, and then covering it up. Elijah brought Yahweh's execution order to Ahab at Naboth's vineyard in Jezreel. This was the very location where Ahaziah would later unsuccessfully flee for his life, less than just a generation after this. Elijah accused Ahab of two main crimes. First, the worship of Baal and Asherah, which was consistent with the same practices of the Amorites. Second, the property theft, libel, and murder of Naboth. Elijah told Ahab, "I will bring disaster upon you. Anyone belonging to Ahab who dies in the city, dogs shall eat. And any one of his who dies in the open country, the birds of the heaven shall eat." Interestingly, we learned that Jehu was actually present when Elijah pronounced Ahab and Jezebel's doom. I think this event has special ramifications for the death of Ahaziah as someone who sort of belongs to Ahab. But it's also important for us to see in the wider context that Ahab's sin of worshiping Baal and Asherah brought about his dynasty's destruction. In the same way, Manasseh, the grandfather of Josiah, was denounced for the exact same crimes in exactly the same way in the chapter in Kings that precedes Josiah's reign characterization. Back to Ahab. Ahab met his fate in a very dramatic way on the battlefield of remote Gilead. Significantly, Kings and Chronicles present this event in nearly identical fashion. At Samaria, Ahab and Jehoshaphat sat before a prophetic council arrayed in their royal robes and received a word from Yahweh. When they went to the battle, Ahab convinced Jehoshaphat of Judah, his ally, to put on Ahab's royal robes. The purpose of Jehoshaphat impersonating Ahab was to protect the Israelite king from the death promised him by Micaiah the prophet. Despite being in disguise, a certain Aramean man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. This event has strong parallels with the chronicler's description of the death of Josiah. But Josiah would not turn away from him, Neco, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Neco from the mouth of God. Really interesting line there. But joined battle in the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." In King's version, Ahab not only died on the battlefield, but his chariot carried him back to Samaria, where his body suffered the dishonor of being licked by dogs and prostitutes washing in his blood. In both versions, Ahab's dishonorable military death closely parallels with Josiah's honorable military death. In Kings, though, Ahab and Josiah's bodies were brought by chariot to their respective capitals, where they were buried in their ancestral tombs, a unique detail for these two kings. Ahaziah of Judah, returning to his family story, was the relative of both of these kings. He was only 8 or 9 years old when Ahab, his maternal grandfather, died in battle, and about 15 when his paternal grandfather, Jehoshaphat, passed away. By this point, things were not going well in Jerusalem. Ahaziah's father, King Jehoram, and his mother, Queen Athaliah, had done their best to make Jerusalem like Samaria. Jehoram was 39 years old when he became sole monarch over Judah. In his brief reign, the Deuteronomistic historian tells us that Jehoram lost control of Edom, and the Levitical town of Libnah revolted at that time. In these turbulent days, Ahaziah became king of Judah at the fairly young age of 22. We can see 22 around 841 BC when Ahaziah became king. We only know a few things about King Ahaziah: his problematic his problematic family, his age, his short reign, and his denouncement by the writer of Kings. Despite only ruling a single year, we are told he walked in the way of the house of Ahab, doing what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was a son-in-law to the house of Ahab. This shows a close connection and something that belongs. Ahaziah was someone who belonged to the house of Ahab. As fate would have it, or as providence would have it, the young Judahite king happened to be visiting his uncle Joram at Jezreel, while the Israelite king was healing from wounds from a battle against the Arameans at the same place his father had been fighting, Ramoth Gilead. This would prove to be a fateful family reunion. Jehu's mad ride to Jezreel resulted in the death of both Joram and Ahaziah. Ahaziah died and was buried in a strikingly similar manner to Ahab and Josiah, at least according to Kings. The death is recorded this way. When King Ahaziah of Judah saw this, he fled in the direction of Beit Hagan. Jehu pursued him, saying, "Shoot him also." And they shot him in the chariot at the ascent to Gur, which is by Ibleam. You can see the site of Ibleam or Kirbet Balama there. Then he fled to Megiddo and died there. Ahaziah's officers carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in his tomb with his ancestors in the city of David. The similarity between Ahaziah and Josiah's death at Megiddo was not retained by the chronicler, who presents a very different version for the death of Ahaziah. But it was ordained by God that the downfall of Ahaziah should come about through his going to visit Joram. For when he came there, he went out with Jehoram to meet Jehu, son of Nimshi, whom Yahweh had anointed to destroy the house of Ahab. When Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab, he met the officials of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's brothers who attended Ahaziah, and he killed them. He searched for Ahaziah, who was captured while hiding in Samaria, and was brought to Jehu and put to death. They buried him, for they said, "After all, he is the grandson of Jehoshaphat, who sought Yahweh with all his heart." And the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. Clearly, this sets up the story of Joash. In this, where we are now is not the place to harmonize what seems to be a contradiction concerning Kings and Chronicles' version of the death and burial of Ahaziah. Ahaziah's death in Chronicles is very, very different than in Kings, even if there is some way to harmonize the two from the point of view of history. I am much more interested in why the chronicler chose to not mention the nature of Ahaziah's death, as well as the location of Ahaziah's death in the plain of Megiddo, or even the burial of Ahaziah in Jerusalem in his version. Each of these details are different. Obviously, there are many differences between Chronicles and Kings when it comes to the presentation of Judah's monarchs. However, if we look at their death details, we see that the chronicler more or less follows King's description in terms of the respective king's cause of death, the location of death, and the location of burial. Of course, the chronicler has narrative expansions for the cause of death for Asa, Jehoram, Joash, and Uzziah, each of which relate to divine punishment as a contributing factor towards the king's death. Regarding the burial of Ahaziah in Samaria versus Jerusalem, the chronicler likely wanted to draw attention to past hostility between Judah and Israel in his own current environment. This reflects the reality of tense Samaritan and Judean relations. On the other hand, these typical didactic additions and changes of the chronicler do not apply to his altered location for Ahaziah's death or the manner of his death. In Kings, Ahaziah was shot while running away from Jehu's forces at a specific location. This was the ascent of Gur by Ibleam, but Ahaziah then ultimately died at Megiddo. In Chronicles, Ahaziah died not furiously riding his chariot away from Jehu. Instead, he was apprehended while hiding in Samaria and then executed by Jehu with no reference to Megiddo. There can be no question that the chronicler knew of the tradition in Kings, as Samuel Kings is his primary source. We've also seen that there's a close connection between these death details between Kings and Chronicles. So why did the chronicler alter Ahaziah's death so that it bore no resemblance to the chariot deaths of his wicked grandfather or his righteous descendant, Josiah? My opinion. The chronicler wanted to save the spectacular, tragic death details for his final hero, Josiah. For the chronicler, including Ahaziah being shot by an arrow in a chariot and his eventual death at Megiddo would spoil one of the key moments in his annals, the death of Josiah. The chronicler wanted to maintain the parallels between Ahab and Josiah while removing Ahaziah from the equation. However, within Kings, the Deuteronomistic historian used geography to either signpost future events or remind readers of past events. Toponyms became a kind of code for projecting elements from past or future Deuteronomistic events into the story. Consider the following that are relevant for our topic. Ahab died trying to reclaim Ramoth Gilead from the Arameans, and Jehu received the kingship through the prophetic declaration at Ramoth Gilead. Jehu proceeded to assassinate Joram at Naboth's vineyard, ending Ahab's dynasty at the exact place where Elijah pronounced Ahab's doom. Jehu shot Ahaziah of Judah at Ibleam. This apparently partially fulfilled Elijah's prophecy. However, Zechariah, the fourth heir of Jehu, was assassinated by Shalem at the same spot, Ibleam. This ended Jehu's dynasty. Ahaziah of Judah ultimately died at Megiddo and was carried by chariot to his capital, Jerusalem, just like his grandfather was to Samaria and just like his great times 7 grandson, Josiah. This is especially important, this idea of geographic coding or geographic references tying things together, when we think about the death of Josiah in Kings, as the text itself is very terse, providing no explicit motivation for either Neco or Josiah's actions. The text simply says, "In his days, Pharaoh Neco, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, but when Pharaoh Neco met him at Megiddo, he killed him." If we read the death of Josiah in the wider context of Kings, we see that Josiah's motivation must have been similar to Ahab's and must have been similar to Ahaziah's. That is to say, there was a military purpose behind why Josiah went there. Indeed, this is how the chronicler interpreted Josiah's actions as a military maneuver against Neco. The chronicler actually cast Josiah in the same light as Ahab in that Josiah disregarded the prophecy of Neco and wore a disguise to protect himself, which, like Ahab's disguise, did not work. I'm going to read the text. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, King Neco of Egypt went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But Neco sent envoys to him, saying, "What have I to do with you, King of Judah? I am not coming up against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God, who is with me, so that he will not destroy you." But Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Neco from the mouth of God, but joined battle in the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am badly wounded." So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in his second chariot and brought him to Jerusalem. There he died and was buried in the tomb of his ancestors. Already we can see some differences, not major ones, but the fact that Josiah dies at Megiddo in Kings versus in Chronicles, he dies eventually in Jerusalem. we have another addition right at the end, which is very important. All Judah and Jerusalem mourn for Josiah. Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. They made these a custom in Israel, for they are recorded in the laments. For the chronicler, Josiah's death was the great tragedy that was at least partly caused by Josiah's own hubris. Josiah tried Ahab's tactic of avoiding prophesied fate through a disguise. In his version, Josiah was the only Judahite king to die in battle at the legendary city of Megiddo against Judah's most ancient enemy, Pharaoh himself. This death was a major turning point for the chronicler, and we learn that Jeremiah himself, the man who prophesied Judah's exile, wrote a lament that was regularly performed in Israel. Clearly, the tragic death of Josiah left a major impression on the chronicler. His audience, now living after the realities of exile and return, must have asked questions like, what if King Josiah had never gone to fight Pharaoh in the first place? However, in Kings, Ahab/Ahaziah and Manasseh/Josiah should be understood as narrative and prophetic pairs. Ahab and Josiah's respective deaths set in motion pent-up disaster for their respective houses. Due to Ahab's repentance, the king had the prophetic assurance that disaster would not strike during his days. It would strike during the days of his house, which would turn out to be his son Jehoram, as well as his grandson Ahaziah, who was the king of Judah. If we take Manasseh and Josiah together, we see that the prophets present a similar promise of impending doom that is softened by a temporal stay of execution. Manasseh's reversal of his father Hezekiah's reforms meant that Yahweh's favor for the kingdom of Judah had come to an end. Like Ahab's Baalism, Manasseh's idolatry was worse than the Amorites. And like Ahab's murder of Naboth, Manasseh had shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another. The Deuteronomistic historian explicitly connects the impending destruction of the house of David and, of course, Jerusalem with the house of Ahab, which was connected with Samaria. He says, I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the plummet for the house of Ahab. I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. I will cast off the remnant of my heritage and give them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies, because they have done what is evil in my sight, and have provoked me to anger since the day of their ancestors came out of Egypt, even to this day. Jerusalem then would become like Samaria, and the house of David would become like the house of Ahab. The uneventful reign of Ammon, 642 to 650 or so, ended in his own assassination by his servants. Ammon died at 24 or 25 years of age, leaving his 8-year-old son, Josiah, to become king in his place. The young boy found himself in a similar position to Ahaziah, ruler over a doomed kingdom. Josiah's reign is almost completely characterized by cultic reform, for which the Deuteronomistic historian gives him the highest of marks. This includes a notice at the beginning of Josiah's record. He did what was right in the sight of Yahweh and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Along with Hezekiah, this is the only king in Judah that gets such a grade. But it gets even better at the end. Before him, there was no king like him who turned to Yahweh with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So in some sense, Josiah is the anti-Ahab. He's the anti-Manasseh. He is the fulfillment of this. He's the inverse of them. Josiah's reign characterization entirely consists of cult reforms, as the king destroyed idolatrous institutions, especially those of Ahaz and Manasseh around Jerusalem, Solomon on the Mount of Destruction east of Jerusalem, and Jeroboam in Bethel. We could spend a lot of time discussing how each of these elements have important geographical implications for earlier events. However, we're going to focus on the end. Despite receiving 2 lengthy chapters in Kings, Josiah was attributed no building activities and only one disastrous military campaign against Neco. The Book of Kings presents the death of Josiah as follows. In his days, Pharaoh Neco, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, but when Pharaoh Neco met him at Megiddo, he killed him. His servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. The people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, anointed him, and made him king in place of his father. The reference to Megiddo would have certainly called to mind the death of Ahaziah, but also past struggles at the former Canaanite city, as well as the building projects of the Golden Age of Solomon. Indeed, it is important that Kings presents Neco's march northward in connection with the river Euphrates. Chronicler talks about it in relationship to a battle at Carchemish, something that's going to happen a few years later. For the writer of Kings, he presents it as accurate details that Neco is going up in support of the Assyrians. But the focus is not on Haran or Carchemish. The focus is on the river Euphrates. The reigns of David and Solomon were marked by rule over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and even to the border of Egypt. This was the ideal for Judahite kings, for kings of the house of David. Given everything that had transpired in the young king's reign, all the hope and the promise, one would have hoped, desired for Josiah, Judah, Jerusalem's fate to now be different, that a new golden age was perhaps on the horizon of territorial dominion, just like the days of David and Solomon. But this was not the case. Disaster struck. The Deuteronomistic historian and the chronicler agree. Josiah's death at Megiddo was Jerusalem's great tragedy. That's the end of the paper when talking about the chronicler and the Deuteronomistic historian's presentation of Josiah. What I'd like to do in the intermediate is to just briefly look at some of the texts that record this death. This text is very close to the chronicler's version. This is from First Esdras, and we read about how the prophet Jeremiah lamented for Josiah, and the principal men with the women have made lamentation for him to this day. Notice it was ordained that this should always be done throughout the whole nation of Israel. There is a decree that Josiah's death should always be remembered and lamented over. We have a similar thing from the Targum of Second Chronicles. This is interesting because it changes some of the details about Neco. It says, the words of the lame one, that's how they interpret Neco, it sounds like lame one, who spoke concerning his idol, and he came to wage war in the valley of Megiddo. But because Josiah did not seek instruction from before the Lord, he went to wage war in the valley of Megiddo. The master of the world requited him. The archers found him and killed him. Interesting thing here is Neco is consulting his idols, and we have in the Targum Josiah given more of a free pass, that he just simply did not consult. It's not a direct disobedience from God from what Neco has to say. And we have also the addition here that the scroll that was written about the lament was by Baruch, who wrote by the mouth of Jeremiah concerning the lamentations. Now, many have wondered, where is this lamentation for the death of Josiah? This is Lamentations 1:8. It says, Yahweh is in the right, for I have rebelled against his word. But hear, all you peoples, and behold my suffering. My young men and women have gone into captivity. The Targum of this passage actually adds to this and connects it with Josiah. It says, Josiah the king went forth and drew his sword against Pharaoh the lame on the plain of Megiddo, which he had not been commanded to do, and had not sought instruction from before the Lord. Therefore archers shot King Josiah, and he died there. Before his spirit left him, he moved his lips and said, the Lord is blameless, for I have transgressed against his Mimra, which is an early expression probably of the idea of the Logos. Hear now, all peoples, the lamentation that Jeremiah made over Josiah, and see my affliction that he has come upon me after his death. My virgins and young men have gone into exile. I'm not going to spend too much time reading this with Josephus, but he has much the same to say. Although he does confuse Megiddo with the site of Mendes, he does at the end of this say, all people mourn greatly for him, lamenting and grieving on his account many days. And Jeremiah the prophet composed an elegy to lament him, which is extant till this time also. Next, we come to what is, I think, a very critical passage, Zechariah 12, 10 through 14, a well-known prophetic passage, especially in terms of messianic theology and typology. It says, I will pour out a spirit of compassion and supplication on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that when they look on the one whom they've pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. So the first simile of comparing how the weeping will be is for the death of a firstborn. The second one is related to the death of Josiah. It says, on that day, the mourning in Jerusalem for this pierced one will be great as the mourning for Hadad Ramon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn, each family by itself. It talks about David's family, the house of Nathan, and so on. I think very clearly this is a reference to what we find in the Chronicler's version of the death of Josiah, which goes back, of course, to the passage in Kings. I don't have time to get into it, but most likely Hadad Ramon refers to a location, not something related to occultic worship. I think it's probably related to a site near there called Ruminata, and perhaps there's a tradition about the exact location of the death of Josiah, some 70 plus years after the exile, writing in the days of Zechariah, after the return. And then finally, and we definitely do not have time to go into all the ins and outs of this, but I think that it stands to reason that these texts of Zechariah can be connected with what John points out both in his gospel as well as the book of Revelation. He's the only one who makes reference to Zechariah chapter 12. In John 19, he quotes Zechariah 12 when he says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. In Revelation 1:7, it says, even those who pierced him. And in the famous passage, Revelation 16:16, he makes the case that they assembled at the place that in Hebrew is called Har Megiddo or Armageddon, which in my view, and we'll have to wait for future discussions, must be connected with Zechariah chapter 12, which in turn should be connected with Chronicles, which in turn should be connected with Kings and the death of Josiah. What Revelation 16:16 is doing there is very interesting. It connects with kings coming from the Euphrates River and most likely a Judahite king about to oppose him. And I think the point of that passage primarily has to do with, at this time, it's going to be different. There's going to be a royal reversal. Josiah will ride to battle on a horse, but this time, Josiah's descendant, I should say, he will not die at the hands of Neco. There will be a royal reversal. And we get that reversal in Revelation 19:11 when we see the one riding on a white horse who in righteousness makes war. And so that just gives you a little bit of background about where I'm going with this study. In any case, thank you for your time, and I hope it was useful.